Well, thank you everybody for being here. And it is a little bit like a reunion. I'm happy you're interested in my book, and I'm happy, Paolo, that we met many years ago at some conference, and we began this conversation that's gone on for a few years, and brought in Alejandro, Sara. It was a big thing for me when I was with you in Trento a few years ago. And you know, if you've read the book and as you hear me speak, you will see the whole homing influence in this book. So right now I am going to attempt to share my screen. As I said, I've got about, these slides are publicly available. There's about 60 of them. And I'm going to go through about half, and I'm going to focus on the ones with images. We do have some beautiful photographs. The book has photos, but they're in black and white. It's funny how things look better digitally than they do on the page now. But as an introduction to the project, I'll say that Manuel and I are the co-authors, but really it felt like there was a cast of thousands. That's an exaggeration, but we had quite a good sized research team, about 10 researchers. I oversaw, it was multi-method, multi-year study. I am a qualitative sociologist, so I oversaw the qualitative portion, which was mostly interviewing, some participant observation, ethnography in parks and gardens in Watts and other parts of the world. And then Manuel, who's actually trained as an economist, oversaw the quantitative portion. And as you may know, it's very, very expensive to do primary survey. So sadly, we could not do that, but they used a lot of census and IPUMS data to do some really interesting mapping, which I will share with you. Okay, let me see if I can remember how to do this. Oops, what happened here? Sequence of events here. You can now see my screen, correct? And let's to okay, you can all see that, right? Yeah, good. Phew. Okay. This image, this mural, is actually on the cover of our book. It was done by two artists, a little artist collective from Oaxaca. You might know Oaxaca has had this sort of renaissance. The revolutionary moments have prompted this renaissance in art, away from folk art towards graphic and political art. And just a mural that these guys did in South LA. I don't personally know this woman, but I do know her mother, who's an indigenous social movements leader in Los Angeles. Okay, so what does it mean that South LA has transitioned from being a historically Black neighborhood, the most important Black urban space in Los Angeles, to now being majority Latino residents? As recently as 1970, it was 80% African American, majority Latino residents today. So our book is an effort to explain how that process happened, what are people's experiences, and really we wanted to fill in the gap. We initially wanted to fill in the gap with what are the Latino experiences and Latino immigrant, Mexican and Central American experiences. There are two other important books, one called Black Los Angeles by the sociologist Darnell Hunt, and another one called Catching Hell in the City of Angels, that really focus on African American experiences. But we felt like there wasn't that book on Latinos. And we did this book actually because community leaders approached us and asked us to correct the narrative. South LA went through a lot of turmoil and violence, including gang violence and police violence and deindustrialization and extreme poverty and the crack cocaine crisis in the 80s. And a lot of journalists and academics have continued to present that vision of South LA, which is one of extreme violence and disruption. And community leaders, community organizers, civic leaders knew that no longer really fit. So they asked us to do this study. And as you know, we wound up really focusing on how people get a sense of belonging, how people seek home. And along the way, I think we really, one of the main upshots of the book is a new kind of Latinidad, a kind of Latino identity that is really strongly affiliated with Black sensibilities, culture, African American political traditions, and that is a big counterpoint to the way a lot of American sociologists look at Latino immigration, which is to say as assimilation to whiteness. So that's sort of a precursor to the study. The research questions were, pretty basic, right? How have Latino immigrants made themselves at home in this historically Black space? We, looked at change over time, across generations. There was a focus on the parks and gardens as well as civic work. And I want to say at the outset, I feel like it was very exciting for me to be part of this larger research team. I'm used to working as a qualitative sociologist, which is to say like a lone ranger, like being alone with my book, with my project for 7 years, just me and my screen, me and my field notes. And here we had we were mostly in the field in 2015. And we had these big roundtable discussions with people coming in, here's what I'm finding this week, and does this jive with what you're finding? And I think here's a different way of looking at it. And I think we were overall very rigorous and careful with the claims we made with our empirical research, but we all know empirical research is partial and incomplete. And part of my hope is that this book will be an invitation for us to come to South LA, because there's so much we left on the table. And there's so much, like when you go to a buffet and you want to eat everything, we thought, oh, we're going to do a study of real estate. We didn't, but I think the real estate is a really important backdrop to the place that is South LA. Entrepreneurship, commercial life. I think a lot of people have this image back from the Rodney King rebellions that all the shopkeepers are Korean American. They're much fewer in number, and there are lots of small Latino business owners and African American business owners as well. One of our research assistants, Veronica Montes, was going to do a study of historic South Central Corridor, which is just full of little panaderias and the quinceañera shops and the marquetas, but that never came to fruition. Similarly, music, South LA begins with, well, it goes much further back, but it gave the world Charlie Mingus, jazz great, Kamasi Washington today. And one of our research assistants who was in the program, who was part of our project, Christy Hernandez, had grown up in South LA and had been part of this kind of informal backyard ska punk music scene. And we thought that was going to be, these things, you can't do everything. And honestly, the book's already kind of fat. We weren't going to do a 4-volume piece. Well, so all of this is to say, I think we worked hard to get it right, but, we didn't, couldn't do everything in this book. So here's all of the quantitative sources that Manuel and his team used. As I said, Manuel Pastor is trained as an economist. He runs this project, was centered in, it's really his research center. I was associate director at that time. It was called the Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration. It's now rechristened as the Equity Research Institute with a slightly broader mandate. Really, the primary sources used was the US Census and the IPUMS data, and then they put this into the census tracks. You'll see the maps that we provide. And a cast of thousands worked on that. And then, the qualitative data is primarily in these chapters. And really where we started with this project was we set out to interview 100 Latino residents. These are one-time interviews. I trained everybody. We used like this ethnographic, field note template for writing notes after the interview. But it was myself and 4 others, 1 postdoc and 3 graduate students who did the interviews. And South LA, as you will see in the maps that I show, is really big. It's a mega neighborhood. It has a population of 850,000 people. It stretches over 50 square miles, right? Part of LA's horizontal kind of city. And so we focused on 3 very, and there's a lot of variation within South LA. So we focused on 3 neighborhoods, Watts, Historic South Central, and Vermont Square, Vermont Slauson, each of which has its own kind of terrain, its own demographic mix, its own particular history. And we were interested in looking at 2 generations to see their experiences. So 2 generations, experiences over time, and 3 particular neighborhoods. And, we obviously set out to interview average working people, laborers, housewives, retired folks, youth, and I will refer now, and then chapter 5 was about the parks and gardens. I kind of extended my earlier research on urban community gardens to look at life in public parks. I wish we had done more public space, but I kind of emphasized the homemaking theme there among men in particular. And then we also conducted about 20 interviews with civic leaders, and we have a smaller segment with African-American residents, mostly women, in Watts. But this is a photo taken by Walter Thompson Hernandez, one of our part of our research team, just a really talented guy. He then became a New York Times video journalist. He's now written a best-selling book about the Compton Cowboys. He did an award-winning podcast. I mean, it was really a pleasure to work with Walter. And as you can see, he's also a very artistic photographer. And this photo is taken at the Stanford Avalon Community Garden in Watts, which came about through a political process. There was a, well, purportedly the largest urban community garden in the whole United States was in Los Angeles, the South Central Farm, and it was bulldozed. There was a big political battle about 15 years ago. And in its wake, Stanford Avalon Community Garden came up in this kind of dead zone. You can see underneath the electrical utility poles. There are 209 plots here. They're very large. As you can see, it's kind of fenced in here. And this friend, I'm going to call him, oh, let's call him Paulo Soto, is an elected leader. It's divided up into 4 sections, which means he is was in charge of collecting the rent, which is substantial at this particular garden. And he's Mayan, he's from Guatemala, he's undocumented, he's bilingual in Spanish and Quiche, but speaks very little English, and he has very low level of literacy skills. He never attended school, but he's quite an engaged community leader. He's been on an LA neighborhood council. He started a boxing program for youth attached to a church, and he was a leader here. I have accompanied him when he dresses up in a suit to go to City Hall to fight back against the increases in the water. And as you probably know, Los Angeles, the United States has about 11 million people who lack legal rights, right? 11 million people who lack legal authorization, yet there are people like Paulo Soto who are very engaged civic leaders in spite of not having legal status, literacy skills, or English language ability. That said, I would also note that civic life engagement is very low for first generation immigrants in South LA, right? They can't vote. English language continues to be a problem. And also just the factor of time. Okay, I'm going to move on to another slide. So our theoretical frameworks, obviously, we wanted to get the story right. It's an empirical project, but we're also not just reporting data, we're trying to sort of innovate theoretical frameworks. And from where I sit in American sociology, there are really 3 frameworks that predominate in immigrant integration literature. And one, as you know, is assimilation, which has like these very long legs in American sociology. I still can't believe when I go to the ASA meetings how many people are working from that framework, but obviously, and they've tried to resuscitate it into so many different ways, and relational assimilation, segmented assimilation, and so on. Can you hear me okay? Is my volume all right? Okay, I'll try to remember to stay close here. But obviously that kind of assimilation framework did not fit what we were seeing. Like, you know, Doug Massey and others have predicted, oh, spatial assimilation, moving from the inner city neighborhood to white suburbs is part of the pattern. Well, guess what? Suburbs in Los Angeles are not all white. They're diminishingly white. And part of our big finding is people we interviewed do not want to leave. People love South LA. That was one of like the big, I don't know, kind of the big surprises, this exceptional love and pride and attachment to place. Transnationalism, as you know, a very popular framework is also, and I really put a lot of transnational questions into our interview guide to pick up aspects of transnational lived life. But as you know, we have a deeply militarized US-Mexico border that essentially traps 11 million people in the United States. So unless people had a good deal of money, flexibility in their work, and a passport, people were not returning to Mexico or to Central America as they might have in earlier years. The kind of transnational life we picked up was sending money home, remittances, and phone calls, or FaceTime sorts of communications, which we see as kind of low level of transnationalism. The kinds of Mexican hometown associations that had been so strong in the 90s, right, really influencing political processes and presidential campaigns, those seem to me to have diminished. And then the other paradigm that is so important in the US right now is really focusing on these mechanisms of exclusion, right? The regimes of deportation, detention, racial exclusions, and certainly that's happening. But honestly, I have to say, as we did our interviews, we were not hearing a lot about family members being, and ICE and deportation, which isn't to say it wasn't happening, but it's kind of a puzzle, honestly. And we think, a little minor hypothesis is that there's so much policing focused on Black male youth that Latino men, and it's Latino men who are mostly picked up by ICE, may evade some of that kind of police surveillance. So this, homemaking, this kind of immigrant homemaking and a homing process is really a framework, thank you everybody in Trento, that really helped us make sense of what we were seeing here. So with both in first generation, I really use this as sort of an organizing schema, looking at processes of how people establish security, familiarity, autonomy, a sense of control over your home space was so important. Really rich data here. Our Latino residents, some had been newly arrived, but many more had initially settled in downtown LA, in the Pico Union area or East LA, and had come which are all traditionally Latino neighborhoods, or have become Latino, Mexican, or Central American neighborhoods, and populated. Really, people were kind of stuffed into small substandard apartments. And South LA is more expansive, especially Watts. Watts we think of as so urban, but honestly, sometimes I was there and I felt there was almost a kind of rurality to Watts, a kind of suburban expanse. And I think this kind of spatial area of stretching out led people to experience South LA is a place where, well, as I'll talk later, where you can do work in your home. You can use your home as an income generating place. You can have loud parties. You can play your music up high. You can grow, vegetables, which I talk about as a kind of ranchofication of South LA. And then another important aspect is really future making. Looking at home and South LA is a place to sort of plot what the next move is going to be. What's going to, what are the aspirations for home ownership? Home ownership is also a big theme, or for the second generation. So we find a very strong sense of Race is important, racial identity is important, but it's really a kind of a place-based racial identity, and one that is not monolithic. I'll say a little bit more about that. So a very common way that American sociologists look at these kinds of transformations in cities is, again, inherited through the Chicago school, and that is this model of ethnic secession, right? The idea that, Jews were here and they were in the markets and they went to the suburbs, and then Korean Americans arrived, and they call that ethnic secession. But I was really influenced by two scholars of race, actually one who got her PhD at USC and is now a professor at Scripps College, and that's Wendy Chang, who wrote this beautiful book called The Changs Next Door to the Diazes, which is actually about the town right next door to me, Alhambra, and about Mexican-American and Chinese life in schools and many other social institutions. And she introduces the notion of racial ethnic sedimentation, really this kind of geologic metaphor. So in South LA, even though the numbers of African Americans still living in South LA has diminished, and Black people are still present, to be sure. But even though their numbers of residents have diminished, there's still a powerful cultural and political influence that shapes Latino life and Latino identities in Watts and other South LA neighborhoods. And then the other scholar is my colleague at USC, now a MacArthur genius, Natalia Molina, who's written a number of interesting books, most recently one with Daniel Hosang, where she introduces the notion of a relational racialization, which is really decentering whiteness. Now, this isn't to say that kind of like white power structures are not at work in South LA. They are, but really you could live your life in South LA until very recently on a daily basis and not see any white people, maybe a few teachers, maybe a principal at the school, but it really is a very much a Black and brown place. And Natalia Molina's concept of relational racialization really gets at how groups, marginalized groups are mutually constituted through their daily interactions in a way that takes us a long way from white assimilation. I guess the other thing I'll add before moving on is that there has been a lot of work. We go through some of this literature in chapter 1 on Black and brown relations in cities. And most of it has focused, like a lot of debates on competition over wages and resources, which isn't to say that hasn't happened, but honestly, African Americans and Latinos, in especially first generation immigrant Latinos, are in totally different labor market segments, right? They're not working largely in the same workplaces or sectors. And African American communities have a very high level of joblessness and unemployment, and also public sector employment. And Latinos have the problem of working poverty, right? Working multiple jobs and barely making a living, especially the first generation. Okay. Let's see. You can't see this photo here, but because I have this text, but these are these kind of big shopping centers that proliferate. They're like basically old warehouses in South LA that are full of sort of micro vendors. They're called swap meets, and they're part of the landscape. You can see people drive up and park at them, and inside you can buy, you know, clothing, all kinds of, you know, small electronic items, cookware. But let's see. What do I want to say here? I guess I'd like to emphasize change over time and change over generations. To get back to the dominant narrative about South LA is a place of a lot of conflict and violence. These were the 80s, the 90s, that kind of deindustrialization moment when factories close up and move offshore or go to Sunbelt cities, provoked a lot of divestment. That's the era of the Rodney King rebellions. Clearly, those issues remain. But the 1990s is, you know, very different portrait than what we found in the current era. Okay. The photograph, another photo by Walter here. Photos, there's 3 large projects. These are, you know, public housing in Watts. This is what they look like. They're actually far better than they used to be. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to go through these maps pretty quickly. But if you have been to Los Angeles, you will recognize up at the top that horizontal line. We call freeways here by their numbers, and we preface them with an article. So that's V10, and it leads west to the beautiful beaches in Santa Monica. And once you go east, it's downtown. And our university is located up at the top there. USC is at University Park. So you can get a sense here of the area that we're calling South LA. You'll see the 110 freeway goes right through it, as does the 105 at the bottom. But these are the various neighborhoods. And I said, each one of them has their own particular character. But these maps were put together by Manuel and his team. And as you can see from the text here, there have been a number of social patterns that have influenced, well, we never call it black flight, but white flight, and then really black flight from South LA. So here's what it looked like in 1970, majority African-American. And by 2010, you can see the dark green areas that have the largest concentrations of African-American residents has moved further to the west. So that Baldwin Hills area, that is a very beautiful high-end area. I would say Leimert Park has now emerged as really the center of Black cultural life in Los Angeles, with a lot of art and music, good housing stock, and a lot of concerns now about gentrification because metro lines have come in, and there's a new tech center, and really areas that are kind of people are clinging to. But as you can see, increasingly African Americans, what happens in the 1980s, 1990s is a lot of African Americans, I believe any working family who could afford to do so, got themselves and their kids out, often went to exurb places, what we call the Inland Empire, Riverside, San Bernardino, further north, Santa Clarita. These are kind of these you know, more affordable suburban places. And I believe more professional class African Americans went to Baldwin Hills, Leimert Park. There's also a great migration south now to Atlanta, right? This is happening from Chicago. It's happening from Los Angeles. People leaving cities in the north and the west and returning to sites in the south. And then more affordable cities like Houston and Las Vegas have a much more affordable housing than does Los Angeles or any of our other coastal cities. And I guess one thing I forgot to mention here that is also part of the story, not our main story we're telling, and that is the incarceration crisis in the United States, I believe also explains the fewer numbers of African Americans in places like South LA and other cities. And so let's kind of reverse the order now and look at the growing Latino population. So you can see it sort of starts really in the east side and the north. So to the right of what we have defined as South LA are these smaller, I would call them kind of industrial suburbs. These were really built for a white working class when there was a lot of industry. Today, these are entirely Latino, mostly Mexican American. And then up at the top, you know, in 1970, there was still very vibrant, kind of like a small industrial, cottage industrial work. You know, the garment sector was much bigger back then, located around downtown. And that kind of explains, you know, Latinos moving there. By 2010, it looks like this. So the Latino population coming to be so much more prominent. So historic South Central up at the top, that top right-hand corner, that was the most, that was like LA's Harlem, right? It gave rise to kind of something like LA's version of the Harlem Renaissance with the Dunbar Jazz Club, important hotel, important churches. When Martin Luther King came to speak in Los Angeles, he spoke there. When Duke Ellington came, he stayed there because there was, you know, redlining. And there's still, it still is kind of like a, many historical markers. There's a jazz festival that happens once a year. There's these kind of markers memorializing an important Black newspaper that had once been featured there. But today it is 90% Latino residents. And there is a sense of Black loss and melancholy over this. I attended a public forum there with Walter, and we heard a locally famous civil rights leader and journalist, now quite old, but very eloquent, who said, we got what we wanted, but we lost what we had. And he was referring to the end of legal segregation that made it possible for African Americans to move out to other neighborhoods, and people did when they had all these problems of substandard housing and police violence. But there's a big sense of loss as well. Okay. Okay. I'm just going to go through these I don't even like to look at these. But they're important demographics that show, I mean, this is kind of interesting to see how the schools have changed over time from being, you know, primarily Black to becoming more Latino. Home ownership, really interesting. So you can see there has been growth some significant growth in Latino home ownership, Latino immigrant home ownership. At one point, Veronica Montes and I thought we were going to do a whole project on this. It was interesting. A surprising finding was to find Latino families who are owners of multiple homes, right? Kind of creating this compound where the parents live here, the kids have their house over a few blocks over. People owning, actually owning income rental properties as well. You know, some data on income, just to prove to you that South LA is still a poor area with incomes that are far below what we see in LA County. And working poverty, Latinos. But let's see, where do I want to go? So I think I already said this. Picture of Jordan High School behind the text here. That's in Watts. Here's a good place for me to start, and a kind of a return to the themes of home. So here's a home in Watts. I mean, I'm just going to start by talking about this image and the materiality of home. This is a house in Watts to which I have been a number of times, and where I interviewed the husband, who's a Guatemalan immigrant who works as a jeweler. There's a small jewelry sector in downtown Los Angeles, and in his backyard, I mentioned part of home life is also innovating spaces for income generation. And he's got a whole workshop in his garage in the back. And it's quite I met these people at the Stanford Avalon Community Garden. They actually live right next door to it. You can see those big utility towers which span above the garden. And they have really a fantastic garden. I would say you can see roses in the front. There's an Italianate emphasis to LA and Pasadena gardens, these, you know, cypress trees you can see there to the right, popular motif, green lawn, fruit trees. His wife is Mexican, so they kind of have this mix of a Mexican, Central American garden with a lot of tropical fruit trees in the back. They have their plot next door, but you will also notice right away the pretty substantial bars you see on the windows, this gate. So this is a big theme. A lot of Latino immigrants came to South LA, and the kind of homemaking they practice is one we call shut in and shut out, right? They really fortified their homes, especially for those who came in this period of kind of extreme violence, where they bought a house or they rented a house and then discovered, oh, they're next door to a crack house where people are dealing drugs round the corner, and there are gunshots outside. So we also discuss, so anyways, there was a lot of this kind of fear and anxiety and a response that is reflected in the materiality of homemaking. This, I'm going to talk about them again. This was the second home they had purchased in Watts. They had first purchased a house and that was in a more dangerous section, a more violent section of Watts, and they actually lost their house. So, you know, a lot of Latino homeowners, we had this big financial real estate crisis around 2007. A lot of people lost their homes, including this family, but they had somehow managed to buy this home, this second home. And in general, our first generation respondents reported a little interaction with their Black neighbors. But then there were some very significant exceptions. And this gentleman, let's see, I'm going to call him Senor Sanchez. I told you he worked as a jeweler. His wife was now disabled, but she had worked at the airport working in services. And somehow they got to be friends with an elderly Black neighbor who needed a place to stay, and he became a boarder in their house. So he paid a fee to stay in a particular room. And then he also became not a babysitter, but somebody who would look after their kids when the parents were both at work, right? Kind of surprising, right? So this is a theme, a big theme in our book, and kind of a finding over and over again. And that is kind of Latino immigrant first generation arriving with kind of a white supremacist mindset, which I believe is nurtured in nation building projects in different ways in Central America and Mexico, that's reinforced by information that circulates transnationally about US racial hierarchies, and is then reinforced by on the street experiences in South LA. But then the whole process of adaptation is living together with African Americans and creating these sort of surprisingly intimate relationships over time. So Black parental mentorship was one of our kind of surprising findings, right? Latina, I think it's especially important for Latina immigrant women who were single mothers and really trying to figure out, like, wow, how do I, what schools to put my kids in? What are the rules here in terms of disciplining children? A lot of reliance on Black neighbors that creates these special kind of relationships. And I think, probably less so for people who didn't have kids. Before I move on from this house, though, I want to tell one more story about Senor Sanchez. And that is, he told me that after coming to this house, he woke up one night to find there were burglars who had broken into his garage and were stealing his gas-powered lawnmowers. And he claimed, and I think I believe him, that he was just wearing his underwear, but he got his machete out from underneath the bed and ran after the burglars and retrieved his equipment successfully with the machete. And what it points to is, so much has been written about over policing, but there is a way in which Latino immigrant residents don't feel they are protected by the police. They don't feel they are particularly the targets of being stopped by the police, but they feel they have to take things into their own hands. So in the book, I do tell the story of a 60-year-old grandma in Watts who had an intruder come into her home when she and her daughter were there, and she just went and she got a rifle and took care of it. She didn't shoot anybody, but she used that rifle. So homemaking, I mean, that kind of like level of security, that sense of security and protection, it sounds very like a wild, wild west out here, doesn't it? But it's part of what's going on because of this very uneven level of policing. Okay, more photographs. How much long, can I go 5 more minutes, Paulo?
5, please.
5, and then.
Thanks.
Yeah. So this family, Walter took this beautiful photo. I think I want to call out again Walter's beautiful photography, but I interviewed both the daughter and the mother here. The father is Guatemalan, the mother is Salvadoran. They have 2 daughters, and this is an instance of one of those families that now has 2 houses. The parents live in one house. The previous house where their kids had been raised, they passed on to this daughter who covers the mortgage there. And in this family, I really loved interviewing. I did the interviews separately. This mother and daughter, they moved to South LA very early on from East LA, and came there because that's where they could afford to buy a house. When they moved here, they were the only Latino family on the block. This young woman told me she was the only non-Black person, student throughout elementary school. All of her friends, all of her classmates were Black. The next door neighbors were African American. And she actually experienced a sense of loss that South LA is no longer as proportionally as African American as it once was. Her mother was one of these, I call them these kind of like luchona Latina mothers who's like, my kids are going to do well. I'm going to, get every opportunity for them. She would go to the school to make sure her daughter was not placed in bilingual classes. She wanted English only, which meant she was with all Black kids. She took them to the library where Black senior citizens would read to them in English because the mother didn't have this English ability. And lo and behold, her daughter went to an Ivy League college. It's very difficult to do, right? Ivy League colleges favor kids from high cultural capital, high financial capital families. She studied for an MBA. She went through all of these, intensive kind of self-loathing, like when you're in that kind of elite institution. But she came out of it and decided she was unhappy working in business. She returned to become a 7th grade math teacher. She runs a little business on the side as a tax preparer and a tutor. And recently, when I saw her at our book presentation, she was fostering a baby. So that was a big deal in her life. Anyways, I don't want to read. I'm just going to see if I can find any more slides with photos. And here are some of these beautiful photos. And I guess I would read the quote below the photos that come from the interviews with this particular individual. So the role of children, or the 2nd generation Latinos, who I tell you feel this affinity with African American cultures and outlooks is very important. And a lot of them really work hard to try to re-educate their parents as well. And I would say, sometimes people ask me, what is your most surprising finding from the study? And so if you were going to ask me that, the answer I will say is, I was unprepared for the extent to which our younger 2nd generation spoke out critically about their cousins and their co-workers and their friends from East LA and the ways they are expressed anti-Black racism. So again, this deep sense of love and pride for this community. So this young woman, who's a mother, is saying she hopes there's a real strong sense of community uplift. Surprising number, I think we oversampled college educated 2nd generation, largely because of our snowball sampling, but it's interesting to see how many are back in South LA, working as teachers, counselors, in nonprofits, and really dedicated to making South LA a better place, to giving back not only to their families, but to the community. More photos by Walter. I'm just gonna go, yeah. I guess I will stop there because I promised.